Cops target fat black man's family, unaware he is a Delta Force commander. It was a typical afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where families could be seen tending to their gardens, children running and playing, and neighbors exchanging casual greetings as they walked past each other. The sun shone through the tall trees, casting long shadows on the sidewalks. The scent of fresh-cut grass hung in the air. In the middle of this peaceful scene stood a large house, home to a family that lived a simple, contented life. The father, a man of considerable size, stood in the front yard, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was a towering figure built like a mountain, yet his movements were calm and purposeful. To the untrained eye, he seemed like just another gentle giant. His family, a loving wife and 2 young children, carried on with their daily activities, unaware that the tranquility they had come to take for granted was about to be shattered. It started with the distant sound of sirens. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder and louder until it seemed to surround the entire block. The man's wife, Maria, looked up from the garden, noticing the police cars pulling into the street. She furrowed her brow, wondering if something was amiss. It wasn't long before the children, a young girl named Sarah and her older brother Marcus, noticed too. Sarah tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking if something had happened. The man, who had been silently observing from the front steps, stood up slowly, his posture rigid. His eyes narrowed and he stepped forward just as several police cars came to a screeching halt in front of the house. Officers began to flood the street, their movements quick and deliberate. The tension in the air was palpable. At first, the family assumed it was a routine check, perhaps a misunderstanding, but as the officers began to approach the house, it became clear this was no ordinary visit. The man's heart began to race, not out of fear but out of instinct. Years of training in high-stress situations had taught him to remain calm, but his protective nature for his family now took over. The wheels in his mind began to turn. He knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. The officers approached the house, their hands resting on their holsters. One officer, a tall, imposing man with a hardened expression, stepped forward and made eye contact with the father. The man, known only as John to those around him, stood still, his calm demeanor betraying nothing of his past. He did not acknowledge the officer's presence. Instead, his attention remained on the situation unfolding in front of him. His mind raced through countless scenarios, mentally preparing for the worst. "I'm going to need you to step over here, sir," the officer barked, his voice authoritative. There was no greeting, no attempt to understand. Just orders. John's wife, Maria, stepped forward, her voice trembling as she asked what was happening. The officer barely looked at her. "Stay back, ma'am," he ordered, his tone dismissive. "This doesn't concern you." It was a simple comment, but it stung. Maria took a step back, instinctively pulling her children closer to her side. Sarah, confused and scared, clung to her mother's arm. Marcus, older and more aware, stood stiffly, his young eyes trying to understand why the situation had turned so tense. He had never seen his father, the gentle giant, react this way before. The officer's gaze shifted back to John. There was an air of arrogance in the officer's stance, a belief that he had all the power. "We're just asking a few questions," he continued, trying to maintain control of the situation. "We've got reports of suspicious activity around here. We need to make sure everything's okay." John's eyes locked onto the officer's. His expression remained unchanged, but in his mind, he was calculating every possible move, every angle. He didn't want the situation to escalate. He didn't want his family to witness what might happen next. He had done everything in his power to keep them safe from the shadows of his past. The officer's tone became more aggressive as they began to surround John, their hands still hovering near their weapons. They spoke in clipped, forceful words, demanding his identification, questioning his role in whatever was happening. Maria's anxiety grew with each passing second. She had never seen John this still, this quiet. It was as if he was observing, calculating every move the officers made. As the officers' demands became more forceful, John's inner soldier began to stir. His training, years of serving in the most dangerous corners of the world, kicked in. He knew how to read people, how to anticipate their next steps, and he knew that if this went wrong, it would all spiral out of control. His family didn't know what he had done, what he had been through, and they never needed to. They didn't need to know the full extent of his past to understand that he would do anything to protect them. Despite the rising tension, John didn't flinch. He simply stood tall, a wall between his family and whatever threat the officers represented. But even as he stood, the realization began to hit him. The situation was no longer in his control. The officers didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't understand the kind of man he was. They didn't understand the kind of power he held in his past. And they certainly didn't realize that in a split second, they had just triggered something that could change everything. Maria's voice trembled again as she stepped forward, trying to reason with the officers. "Please," she begged, "we haven't done anything wrong. What's going on?" But the officer only looked at her coldly, his eyes narrowing. "Just stay back," he repeated. "This doesn't concern you." The word stung, but it was the look in his eyes that made John's blood run cold. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This was about power, about control. And as the officers closed in, John knew that the moment to act was fast approaching. His protective instincts flared. He stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the way between the officers and his family. His voice, though calm, had an edge to it. "You need to back off," he said, his words carrying weight. The officer hesitated, his eyes flickering with confusion. The tension in the air thickened. John's family watched silently, unsure of what was happening but sensing the danger rising. And as the seconds ticked by, the confrontation reached its tipping point. John stood still, his body unmoving as the officers continued to circle him, the tension in the air growing with each passing second. His calm, measured demeanor didn't show it, but his mind raced through years of training, countless missions, and the skills he had honed. Skills he'd sworn never to use again. He'd sworn to leave that life behind, to protect his family and keep them safe from the dangers of his past. But in this moment, everything was spiraling out of control, and he knew deep down that there was only so much patience one man could have before his silence would be mistaken for weakness. The police officers continued their commands, not realizing the mistake they were making. They didn't know who John really was. They didn't know what he was capable of. For all they knew, he was just another big guy, a man who could easily be intimidated. But that was the very thing they didn't understand. The size, the silence, the stillness, it was all a mask, a shield for what lay beneath. John's mind began to flash back to the days before he had ever stepped into this quiet suburban life, to the days when he wore a uniform of a different kind, a uniform that wasn't about enforcing the law, but about protecting it from the shadows, a uniform that had seen the worst parts of the world, that had been stained with the dust of foreign lands, the sound of gunfire echoing through his ears. He had been part of an elite group, a force unlike any other. He had been a Delta Force commander, tasked with missions that no ordinary soldier would dare to take on. It hadn't been a choice for John. He didn't ask to be recruited into the Delta Force. It was a life he was born into, a life where sacrifice, hardship, and training became the core of his existence. It wasn't about the glory or the medals. It was about the mission. It was about protecting the innocent, even if that meant putting your life on the line again and again. But that life, filled with danger and secrecy, came at a cost, one that John had learned to accept. He had seen the horrors of war. He had done things that no human being should ever have to do, and in the end it was all worth it if it meant keeping people safe. But it wasn't just the war that had shaped him. It was his upbringing, one that had taught him the value of silence, the value of patience, the value of control. Growing up, John had always been the biggest kid in his class, not just in size but in strength. His father, a former military man himself, had instilled in him the importance of restraint. "A strong man doesn't need to prove his strength," his father used to say. "His silence speaks louder than his fists ever could." Those words had stuck with John his entire life. They had shaped him, molded him into the man he had become, the quiet giant who could stand in a room and not say a word, but whose presence could command respect. But that strength didn't just come from his physical prowess. It came from the depths of his heart, from the love he had for his family. Maria, his wife, and their 2 children were his world. They were the reason he had chosen to step away from his dangerous past. They were the reason he had traded in his uniform for a regular job, a regular life. They were his motivation, his peace, but even as he tried to shield them from the darkness that had once consumed him, he knew that the past had a way of catching up with you. He had tried to bury it, tried to leave it all behind, but now it was staring him right in the face. The officer in front of him continued to bark orders, still unaware of the gravity of the situation. "We need you to step back. This is a serious matter," he insisted, his hand gripping the taser at his side. John stood unmoving, his gaze unwavering. His family watched, their eyes wide with uncertainty. Maria's face was pale with fear, and even the children could sense the shift in the air. They had never seen their father like this, silent but radiating a power that none of them could understand. For a moment, it was as if the entire world had come to a standstill. The officer's hand twitched, the air thick with anticipation. The situation could go either way. But John knew better than anyone that violence was never the answer. He had been trained to kill, yes, but he had also been trained to protect. And right now, protecting his family meant keeping his calm and diffusing the situation before it escalated further. Maria's voice broke the silence. "Please, what is this about?" Her voice trembled, but there was a hint of defiance in it. She wasn't going to let them treat her family this way. John could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also something else, an unwavering trust in him, a belief that he would handle this. And in that moment, John realized that he had to. Not just for his family, but for himself. He couldn't let his past haunt him forever. He had to stand up, not as the soldier, but as the father, as the man who had chosen to build a new life. John took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the officer in front of him. He could feel the old instincts rising within him, urging him to act, but he knew the power of control. He had to control his emotions, control the situation before it got out of hand. The officer's voice grew more impatient, his authority faltering as he realized John wasn't responding as he expected. "You're not above the law," the officer snapped. "Step away from your family, now." That's when John made his move. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to show his hand. He simply stepped forward, his large frame blocking the officer's path. It wasn't an aggressive move, but one that commanded attention. "I said." John spoke quietly, but his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen and done things others couldn't even fathom. "You need to back off now." The officer froze, his eyes scanning John's face, trying to read him. For the first time, he hesitated. He didn't know who this man was, but in that brief moment, he realized that he was no ordinary person. This wasn't some ordinary suburban dad. This was something else entirely. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. It was in this moment that John's past finally began to surface, not in a flash of violence, but in the quiet strength that defined him. He wasn't just a man of power. He was a man of control, of restraint. And in that moment, he showed the officer and everyone watching that true strength was never about flexing muscles or threatening words. It was about knowing when to stand still, when to be silent, and when to walk away from conflict without ever losing ground. The seconds ticked by, but for Maria and the children, it felt like time had frozen. John stood in front of them like a towering wall, his back straight, his face a mask of calm composure. The officers around them had been stunned into silence by the unexpected shift in the tension. The momentary hesitation from the lead officer spoke volumes, but Maria could see something else in her husband's eyes, something she had never seen before. It was the calm before a storm. It was control, but it was also something deeper, something that made her heart race with both fear and admiration. Her mind flashed back to the early days of their marriage. John had always been the quiet one, the strong, silent type who never asked for attention. They had met in college, and from the start Maria had known there was more to him than he let on. He was always watching, always calculating. It wasn't that he was distant, but there was a certain restraint to him that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't until after they had married and moved into the house where they now lived that the full weight of what John had left behind became clear. But even then he had never spoken about it. Not in detail. Maria had always wondered about his past, the part of him that he kept locked away. He had explained little, only that he had been in the military and special forces, but beyond that he remained tight-lipped. She knew he carried the scars of his past, the kind that no one could ever truly understand unless they had walked the same path. Now, as she stood there, watching the officers hesitate before John, Maria understood. She had always known he was capable of so much more than he let on. But seeing it in person, witnessing the sheer power of his presence, took her breath away. It was as though the quiet, unassuming man she had married had suddenly become someone else entirely. Sarah, the younger of their two children, clung to her mother's side, her small fingers gripping Maria's arm. Her wide, innocent eyes flicked between her father and the officers, confusion written all over her face. She had never seen her father in such a tense situation. Sarah had always known John to be the protector, the one who made everything right. But now, as the tension thickened, she was beginning to see that her father was more than just a protector. He was a force to be reckoned with. Marcus, her older brother, had always been more aware of things. He had always been sharp, noticing details others missed. His eyes locked on his father, his expression a mix of curiosity and something else, recognition. Marcus had grown up with the stories of his father's strength, the whispered tales from family and friends about the things John had done in his past. He had always been proud of his father, but now, seeing the way the officers faltered in front of him, Marcus felt something new stir within him. Pride, yes, but also a sense of awe. He had always wondered what his father's life had been like before they moved into their quiet home. Now it seemed that the mystery was about to unfold. The officers had stepped back, their gazes fixed on John. They were confused, their authority suddenly questioned. But it wasn't just confusion that hung in the air. It was a deep, unspoken respect. John hadn't shouted, hadn't made a move to physically assert himself. Instead, he had stood firm, still as a statue, commanding the space with nothing more than his presence. The lead officer, a man named Collins, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Sir, we're just doing our job," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "But we need you to step back now." John's eyes never left Collins. His voice was steady when he spoke, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I told you to back off." The words weren't an order, but a quiet declaration. He wasn't going to give in, not without a fight. Not without ensuring his family was safe. The officer, still unsure of what to make of this massive, silent man, looked back at his colleagues. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to proceed. Collins could sense the underlying threat in John's voice, but he didn't know the extent of it. He didn't know the kind of man he was dealing with. Maria's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold. She wanted to step forward, to do something, anything, to help her husband. But she knew better. John didn't need her to intervene. He needed her to trust him. He needed her to stay calm. So she stood still, holding her children close, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What if the officers didn't back down? What if this escalated into something they couldn't control? What would happen to their family? She wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that John could handle it, but there was a fear deep inside her heart that she couldn't shake. She couldn't bear the thought of something happening to him, of her children growing up without their father. Sarah tugged on her sleeve, her voice small and tremulous. "Mom, is Daddy going to be okay?" Maria turned to look at her daughter, her heart breaking at the fear in the little girl's eyes. She bent down to her level, her voice soft but firm. "Daddy is strong, sweetie. He's going to keep us safe." The words were more for herself than for Sarah. She had no idea how this would play out, but she did know one thing for sure. John would do everything in his power to protect them, even if it meant revealing a part of himself they weren't prepared for. As the minutes passed, the officers slowly began to disperse, their hesitation slowly giving way to resignation. The situation had diffused, at least for now, but the tension remained thick in the air. The lead officer, Collins, reluctantly nodded to his team, signaling for them to step back. "All right, we'll go," he muttered, his voice low. "But don't think this is over." John didn't respond. He simply watched as the officers retreated, his eyes cold and calculating. He had done what he needed to do. He had protected his family, and that was all that mattered. But as the officers pulled away, Maria could see the deep, silent turmoil within her husband. She knew he had done everything he could to avoid this confrontation, to keep his past buried. But now the cracks were beginning to show. She knew that whatever secrets John had been hiding, they couldn't stay hidden for much longer. And as the family stood together, watching the officers drive away, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. They had been lucky this time, but she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The life they had built together was in danger. And it wasn't just from the officers, it was from the past that John had tried so hard to bury. The struggle was far from over. But as long as they stood together, they would face whatever came next. The tension in the air had not dissipated. If anything, it had only intensified. The police cars had driven off, but the calm John had projected to the officers lingered like an unspoken challenge. Maria stood by his side, her hand resting on his arm, trying to steady herself after the intense confrontation. Her children, still in shock, clung to her, unsure of what had just happened. The neighborhood, once peaceful, had become a place where the weight of unspoken questions hung over every passerby. As the minutes passed, John took a deep breath, feeling the pressure in his chest. He had handled the officers, but that didn't mean the situation was over. He had seen the look in their eyes, the hesitation, the uncertainty. They hadn't understood him, and perhaps they never would. But there was something deeper at play now, something he hadn't anticipated. His family had seen him, truly seen him for the first time. They were no longer just the wife and children of a quiet man. They had witnessed the glimpse of a man who was capable of much more than they could ever imagine. And that realization weighed heavily on him. Maria turned to look at him, her eyes filled with questions. "John, what was that?" Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor of fear underneath. "What are you hiding from us? Why didn't you tell me? Tell us?" John met her gaze, his heart heavy with the burden of years of silence. He had promised her that he would never bring the past into their lives, that they would be free of it. But now, as the weight of his decisions pressed down on him, he knew the time had come. His family could no longer live in the shadow of secrets. They needed to understand who he truly was, what he had done, and why he had chosen to leave it all behind. "I didn't want to scare you, Maria," John began, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I wanted to protect you, to give you a life where you didn't have to know the things I've done." "The things I've seen?" Maria shook her head, her eyes brimming with emotion. "You think I couldn't handle it? That we couldn't? John, we're your family. We're supposed to face everything together." Her voice was a mixture of frustration and sadness, as if a wall between them had suddenly come crumbling down, revealing something neither of them had ever expected. John turned away for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always known that someday this moment would come, but he had hoped it would be a distant possibility. He had chosen to live in the shadows, to remain silent. But now the past was no longer something he could bury. Before he could say anything more, a sharp knock interrupted the moment, sending a ripple of unease through the family. Maria flinched and John's entire posture stiffened. It was a feeling he knew all too well, a feeling of being hunted. He stepped in front of Maria and the children instinctively, his protective instincts kicking in. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice urgent yet calm. Maria nodded, holding Sarah and Marcus close as John moved toward the door. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. This was no ordinary visitor. John's instincts flared, every muscle in his body tense. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't expected the consequences to catch up to him so quickly. But here they were. The danger was closing in. He opened the door just a crack, his eyes narrowing as he peered out into the dimming light. Standing on his doorstep were two figures, both in uniform, but not the local police. They wore tactical vests, their faces concealed by dark sunglasses. John knew exactly who they were, and his heart sank. "They've come for me," he muttered under his breath, his mind racing with the weight of his past decisions. The two men looked at each other briefly before one of them spoke. "We need to talk, Commander." John's heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone he had once fought alongside, someone he had trusted with his life. But that life was supposed to be behind him. He had walked away from the missions, from the violence, from the constant weight of responsibility, and now they had come for him. "You shouldn't be here," John replied coldly, his hand resting on the doorframe, still holding it slightly ajar. "This life is over. It's been over for years." His words were quiet but firm, each one laced with finality. The other man, who had been silent up until now, took a step forward. His posture was rigid, his eyes scanning John with a mixture of respect and urgency. "You don't get to decide when it's over, John," he said, his voice low and edged with authority. "The mission's still active. You're still needed." John shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I'm not a part of that anymore. I left it all behind, but the man didn't back down. You know better than anyone that you don't walk away from this. You made an oath, and that oath is bigger than any family, any quiet life you've built. We need you, John." A tense silence filled the air. John's eyes flickered to the interior of his home. where his family waited, unsuspecting of what was unfolding just outside. His chest tightened. This was the moment he had feared, the moment when his past would bleed into his present, when the shadows would no longer stay in the dark. "You're asking me to go back to that life?" John asked, his voice steady but the weight of the question heavy in the air. The man's answer was simple. "It's not a choice anymore." John knew there was no turning back from this. The world he had left behind, the missions, the danger, the war, it had always been waiting, lurking in the background, ready to pull him back in. He had hoped that he could shield his family from the violence of his past, that he could leave it all behind. But now, standing on the threshold of his home, John realized the truth. The past never truly left you. It followed you, shadowed you, until the moment it could pull you back in. He glanced over his shoulder at Maria, who had stepped forward, her eyes wide with confusion and concern. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why these men were here, but John knew. He knew exactly what was at stake. "I'll go," he said, his voice thick with resolve, "but not without my family." His words were final, unyielding. He wasn't going to return to that life without them. They would face this together or not at all. The men exchanged a look, their faces unreadable behind the sunglasses. After a moment of hesitation, they nodded. "We'll arrange for their safety," one of them said, his tone begrudging. "But the mission is non-negotiable." John took one last look at his home, at his family, before stepping outside. The door clicked shut behind him, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. The man who had once been a soldier, a commander of the elite Delta Force, had returned. And now, the real fight was about to begin. The air felt thick as John stepped away from the door, his boots making a quiet but deliberate sound on the hardwood floors. The two men in tactical gear stood just outside, their presence a stark reminder of the life he had tried so desperately to leave behind. Maria stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame, her eyes locked on her husband. She could sense the change in him. Something had shifted. The man she had known as her loving, protective husband was now a stranger, surrounded by ghosts he had kept buried for so long. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words caught in her throat. John raised his hand, signaling for her to stay silent, his gaze fixed on the two men. One of them, a tall figure with a weathered face and a deep scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His eyes, cold and calculating, met John's. "We don't have time for questions," the man said, his voice like gravel. "There's no room for negotiation. We need you back, Commander. This isn't a request. It's an order." Maria felt a chill run down her spine, but it wasn't from the cold night air that had begun to seep into the house. It was from the words, the finality in them. John had left this life behind, built a family, a future. He had promised her they would never face the darkness again. But now it was knocking on their doorstep, and she could see the internal struggle on his face. "John," Maria finally whispered, her voice shaky. "What are they talking about? What's happening?" Her eyes were filled with confusion and fear. John wanted nothing more than to ease her worries, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the truth was, he didn't know if it would be. He had always protected her from the harsh realities of his past, keeping it locked away in the deepest corners of his mind. But now the truth was too close to ignore. The second man, quieter than his companion but no less intense, shifted his weight. He was younger, with sharp eyes that seemed to analyze every movement John made. "The mission we've been assigned is too important," he said. "The intel you have, your expertise, it's critical. You know that." John closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw tightening. He could feel the weight of the past pushing down on him, the weight of a lifetime of decisions made in the heat of battle, in the shadows of war. He had promised himself that his family would never face the consequences of his actions, but that promise was quickly unraveling. "I told you," John's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. "I left all of that behind. I walked away. I'm not your commander anymore. I'm just a man who wants to live in peace with his family." The men exchanged a look as if this was the last thing they had expected to hear. The man with the scar stepped forward, a faint smile crossing his face. A smile that held no warmth. "You can pretend all you want, but the world doesn't work like that, John. You're still a commander whether you like it or not. The skills you have, the knowledge, it's not something you can erase." John took a deep breath, feeling the tension tighten in his chest. His family was behind him in the shadows, unsure of what was happening. They didn't know what he had done, what he had been trained to do, and he had never wanted them to. He had wanted them to see him only as a father, a husband, the man who protected them from the world. But the world had a way of breaking down walls, and now his walls were crumbling. "Tell me what you want from me," John finally said, his voice low and controlled. "Because I'm done running. But I won't let you drag my family into this." The scarred man nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift in John's demeanor. "The mission requires all hands on deck. We've already lost too many people, and now we need you back in action. Your experience is unmatched. You're the only one who can finish this, and you know what's at stake." John's eyes darkened, his mind flashing to the missions he had completed in the past. Missions that had haunted him long after they were over. He had been a part of a team that had infiltrated enemy territories, executed covert operations, and dealt with the consequences of decisions that no one should have to make. It wasn't glory. It was survival. It was sacrifice. It was pain. He didn't want to go back. He didn't want to leave his family, but deep down he knew he couldn't walk away from this. He had always known that someday he would be called back. It wasn't just about duty, it was about survival. His skills were needed, and no matter how much he had tried to bury them, they were still part of who he was. The younger man stepped forward, his voice quieter, more urgent. "This isn't a request, John. It's bigger than you. It's bigger than your family. We need you. The mission needs you." John's gaze turned to the door behind him, where Maria and the children were standing, their faces filled with concern. His heart clenched. He had promised them safety, a normal life. But now he was faced with a choice: honor his past and the people who depended on him, or protect the family he had built, the family that was everything to him. As the silence stretched between them, the weight of the decision hung in the air. John had never been one to run from responsibility, but now the stakes were higher than ever. The consequences of his actions would affect not only him but also his family, the people he had sworn to protect. "John," Maria's voice broke through the tension, her tone filled with an unspoken plea. She had seen the shift in him, felt the change. She had always trusted him, but now she wasn't sure if the man she had married was still the same. The man standing before her was someone else entirely, someone she didn't know, someone who had never fully let go of the past. "I have to go," John said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision, "but I'll be back. I swear to you, Maria, I will come back." The words were a promise, but they didn't feel like one. They felt like an uncertainty, a hollow vow made in the face of a war he couldn't escape. John turned to the men at the door, his shoulders squared, his eyes hardening with resolve. "Give me a moment to say goodbye." "I won't be rushed," the scarred man nodded, stepping back with the younger officer. They knew better than to argue with someone like John. He was a man of duty, a man of action, and they needed him. John walked slowly toward Maria, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. He could feel the eyes of his children on him, but he didn't turn around. He didn't want them to see the conflict inside him, the part of him that wanted to stay to protect them from the truth. But the truth was inescapable. He knelt down in front of Sarah and Marcus, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. "Listen to your mother," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'll be back. I promise." Sarah, confused, took a step forward, her small hands reaching out to him. "Daddy, where are you going?" John didn't have an answer for her. All he could offer was a smile, a forced, painful smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I have to do something important, but I'll be back before you know it." With that, he turned to Maria. She had tears in her eyes, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. They both knew that he was leaving, and they both knew that things would never be the same again. John stood up, his back straight, his heart heavy. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. The night stretched on like an unbroken silence, thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. John had left with the men who had come to claim him, leaving his family behind in the house that had been a sanctuary from the horrors of his past. But as he stepped into the unknown, he could feel the weight of what he had just done, the weight of the promise he had made to return, a promise that felt more like a lie with every step he took. His heart had already been torn between two worlds, the world of duty, of the man he had once been, and the world of family, of the life he had tried so desperately to build. He had always known that someday the past would catch up with him, but he had never expected it to do so in such a way. The calm, suburban life he had fought for was slipping through his fingers. and no matter how much he wanted to ignore it, no matter how much he wanted to hold on to the life he had created, it was impossible to escape the call of duty. Maria had watched him leave in silence, her face pale, her eyes full of confusion and fear. She had trusted him, trusted that they would be able to move forward, that his past would remain buried. But now she was left in the dark, unsure of what had happened or what would come next. The weight of his absence had already settled heavily on her shoulders, and the questions she had kept buried for so long began to surface, demanding answers she wasn't sure she was ready for. The children were asleep now, or at least Maria hoped they were. Sarah had cried herself to sleep, clutching her stuffed bear tightly as if it could protect her from the uncertainty that had invaded their home. Marcus, ever the observer, had remained quiet, his young mind piecing together the fragments of what had transpired. Maria had watched her children, each of them lost in their own thoughts, and she felt the silence grow even heavier. The walls of their home felt cold now, like they were closing in, suffocating her. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers, needed to understand why this was happening, why John had left them, and why it had come to this. With a deep breath, she stood up and walked to the window, looking out into the night. The shadows of the trees outside swayed in the wind, casting long, eerie shapes on the ground. She could still hear the faint sound of the men's vehicles leaving, the quiet hum of their engines fading into the distance. But it wasn't the cars that echoed in her mind. It was the haunting uncertainty of what had just happened. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to calm down. She turned away from the window and moved toward the door, her steps hesitant but determined. She would wait for him. She would wait for him to come back and explain everything, to make it all right again. But deep down she knew he wasn't coming back the same man. The John she had married, the man she had built a family with, was gone. The past had claimed him once more, and she wasn't sure if there was any way to get him back. As she moved toward the door, she heard a sound, a soft knock followed by the unmistakable sound of the door creaking open. She froze, her heart leaping in her chest. Could it be John? Had he come back? Her thoughts raced, her breath catching in her throat as she turned toward the door, her hands trembling. The door opened wider, and she saw him. Not John, but one of the men, the one with the scar running down his cheek. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes scanning the room with military precision. He didn't speak at first, but the tension in the air was enough to make Maria's stomach churn. She knew immediately that something wasn't right. "Where is he?" Maria asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. She stepped forward, her eyes searching the man's face for any hint of what was happening. The man's face remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, something that told Maria everything she needed to know. This wasn't just some mission. It was bigger than that, and John had been pulled back into something much darker than she had realized. "Where is my husband?" she repeated, her voice now more forceful, though still edged with fear. The man sighed, a deep, resigned sound. "He's gone for now. He's doing what needs to be done. But you need to understand something, Maria." Maria took a step back, her pulse quickening. "Understand what?" The man looked down for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "Your husband. He's a part of something that doesn't just go away. His skills, his experience, they're needed. You saw the way he stood earlier, the way he handled those officers. He's not just a man. He's a soldier. He's a commander. And that life doesn't just fade." Maria's chest tightened as his words sank in. She had known deep down that John was hiding something, but hearing the man confirm it, hearing the words spoken aloud, felt like a cold slap to her face. John hadn't just been a soldier. He had been someone else entirely, someone who could never truly escape the life he had chosen. Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to maintain her composure. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do I do now?" The man paused for a moment, studying her. "You wait. You trust that he'll do what's necessary to keep you safe. But you also need to prepare for the reality of what this life entails. Your husband is caught between two worlds now, and he can't stay here forever." Maria's mind spun. Her heart ached with the realization that this wasn't just some misunderstanding. John had been living a double life, a life she had never fully understood. And now, that life had returned to claim him, pulling him away from everything he had built. The future they had dreamed of seemed so distant now, like it was fading away with every passing moment. "But he promised me," Maria whispered, the words barely audible. "He promised he would stay. He promised we would be safe." The man's expression softened, though it was clear he had no answers. Promises are hard to keep when the world changes, Maria. But he'll return. We'll make sure of it. We always do. With that, he turned and left, leaving Maria alone with the weight of his words. She stood there frozen as the door clicked shut behind him. The silence in the house felt deafening now, as if the world outside had moved on without her, leaving her in a void. She walked slowly to the living room, her mind reeling, trying to piece together the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. The man who had promised to protect her, to give her a normal life, had never fully left the shadows behind. He had only hidden them from her, keeping her safe from the truths he couldn't face. But now those truths were catching up with them both, and there was no escaping them. She sank into the couch, her head in her hands, trying to make sense of everything. She had to be strong for the kids. She had to hold it together no matter how much it hurt. But for the first time, she felt the fear take root deep inside her. What had she really married? What was this man she had loved for so long? And most importantly, what would happen to them when he returned? The unknown stretched out before her, dark and uncertain, and all she could do now was wait. The days dragged on, each one blending into the next like an endless blur of uncertainty and waiting. Maria spent her time keeping the house in some semblance of order, tending to the children and pretending that everything was normal. But inside she could feel the cracks starting to appear, the tension between the past she had imagined with John and the truth that had now been revealed. She didn't know when he would come back or what kind of man he would be when he did. The future seemed like a distant dream, a world that once felt tangible but now seemed forever out of reach. Sarah had stopped asking about her father. She simply held on to the stuffed bear he had given her years ago, the one she carried everywhere. It was her only comfort now. Marcus, however, had grown more distant, his eyes always lingering on the window as if waiting for something to appear. There was a quiet understanding in his gaze, an acknowledgement that his father had always been more than he seemed. But that didn't make it any easier for him to cope with the uncertainty, the absence of the man who had been his rock. John's absence weighed heavily on the family, but Maria could feel a shift deep inside her. It wasn't just the fear or the anger at the lies, but something else. Something that had always been there, buried deep within her, waiting to be unlocked. She knew John. She had known him better than anyone, even if she hadn't fully understood the man he had been before he came into her life. And that trust, that bond between them, was something that could not be broken by the secrets of his past. She had always known that John was more than just a soldier. He was a protector. He had always been the one to shield her from harm, to keep their family safe. And now, in this moment of uncertainty, Maria realized that it was time for her to be the protector, to hold her family together, even when the world around them seemed to be falling apart. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the sky, Maria sat in the living room, her hands resting on the arms of the chair. She had stopped waiting for the phone calls, stopped holding her breath whenever a car passed by the house. She knew, deep down, that John wasn't just coming back for them. He was coming back for something bigger, something that transcended their family, something that couldn't be ignored. She didn't know what that would mean for them when he returned, but she had to trust that he would come back. It was then that she heard the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel. The sound was distant at first, but it grew closer, closer until the unmistakable hum of an engine filled the quiet evening air. Her heart raced and she stood up, her breath catching in her throat. There was only one vehicle that made that noise, only one reason someone would be arriving at this hour. She moved toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. She had no idea what she would say to him, how she would face the man who had left her in the dark. But she couldn't just stand there, waiting for answers she might never get. She had to see him for herself, had to confront whatever part of him had returned. The door swung open, and there he was, John standing on the porch, his figure silhouetted against the fading light of the sky. He looked different. There was no mistaking it. His eyes, once filled with warmth and love, now held something colder, something harder, something that spoke of the battles he had fought, of the decisions he had made. But even as the weight of his past clung to him, Maria could see the man she had always known beneath the surface, still there, still alive. He hadn't been consumed by the darkness. He had just been swallowed by it, temporarily lost but not gone forever. She stepped forward, not sure whether to embrace him or demand answers. But before she could move, John raised a hand, his face etched with exhaustion. Maria, he said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of everything he had been through. I'm sorry, Maria's chest tightened. Sorry for what, John? Sorry for leaving us in the dark? Sorry for putting our family through this? Her voice cracked, the frustration of everything she had kept bottled up finally spilling over. What was it all for? What did you leave us for if not for us? John took a step closer, his eyes searching hers for the words to explain, but there was no easy answer. I didn't want this. I didn't want to drag you into it. But you need to understand there are things I can't escape, things I'm tied to whether I like it or not. Maria shook her head, her emotions a whirlwind. And what about us, John? What about me? What about the family we built? Her voice broke, the tears she had been holding back spilling over. You promised me we would be safe. You promised we would have a life, together. John lowered his gaze, his hands clenched at his sides. I never meant to hurt you. But the truth is, Maria, the world doesn't stop because we want it to. The world moves on, and sometimes we have to move with it. Maria took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She wanted to hate him for leaving her in the dark, for pulling her into a life she had never asked for. But she couldn't, because she knew him. She knew that the man standing before her would never do anything to hurt her.
He had fought for this life, fought for their family.
And as much as it pained her, she realized that he was doing it again. Not for himself, but for them. You don't have to do this alone, Maria whispered, her voice full of quiet strength. We're in this together, John. Whatever comes next, we face it as a family. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your own anymore. John's eyes softened as he stepped closer, his hand gently brushing her cheek. I've always carried it alone. But for you, for them, he nodded toward the house. I'll fight for us. I'll fight for you. Maria nodded, her chest tight with emotion. She had always known that John was capable of so much more than anyone could see. But in that moment, she realized something even deeper. Strength wasn't just about fighting or protecting. It was about the willingness to face the darkness together, to stand by each other no matter what. John leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, his voice soft but filled with conviction. I'll never let you go, Maria, no matter what happens. We're in this together for better or for worse. And as he held her in that moment, Maria knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, because the love they shared, the strength they built as a family, was far stronger than any darkness that could come their way. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. No matter how far the past reached, no matter how much danger loomed, they would protect each other. Together they were unstoppable,